Okay. So we're going to be looking at the reasons for the development from archaic to classical sculpture. Oh, sorry. My remote clicker dropped, and so shuffle that. Come on. Okay, so take a few moments in your groups, and I would like you to look at the style of this and see if you can decide what the time period of this is, right? So what's the time period for this type of sculpture? Focus on how they're similar, but how they're different. So go ahead and chit chat. Trevor, feel free to jump into maybe another table to chit chat with your neighbors. Okay, what do you think the time period is? Yeah. It's archaic. Is there anything about these sculptures that read archaic? Right. She in particular, you can see her mouth is turned up. And so she has that archaic smile. Yep, you're right. Pleated hair, stiff. Right? Anything else that's archaic about it? Yeah. Right. So she is, I mean, they're both pretty stiff. Like her feet doesn't have one foot striding forward, but she does have like, you know, she's got one arm bent and kind of attached to her body. You do see her breast kind of pressing through the fabric. So you still see the indentation of the human form. And she's got that little cinched waist to kind of show off her waist and her hips. Is there any major difference that you see between these figures? Any major difference? Maybe it's too obvious to notice. Isn't one dressed and one is not? One is nude and one has clothes. And so we're going to be looking at our core figures today. Core figures are our female figures. And so you probably watched this video on the Peplos Kore from the Acropolis. And so I'm not going to bother watching it again. But we'll focus on breaking down these 4 questions based on that video, okay? So what is she wearing, right? And what is it an image of, right? And then where was it originally placed? So she is a young woman, right? We're looking at just basic content here. We see a young woman, and she's wearing either a Peplos or a kitan. These were common dresses of women of the day. So a Peplos was basically like a rectangular piece of fabric that you would then kind of wear and drape over your body, and you might cinch it with a belt. And so common everyday people wore this. When we look at her, we can tell she's archaic because she has her archaic smile, right? It's hard to see from our image, but there are holes in her head. And so we think she was wearing a crown. So that probably tells us a little bit that she's probably more than just your average woman. And she also, once upon a time, had animals painted on her skirt. You can see remnants of it right here, right? You can see a little bit of remnants of animals on her skirt, okay? Now, she was originally placed on the Acropolis. If you remember from our video yesterday, talking about how Athens went to war against the Persians, there was an Acropolis, right, before the Acropolis, the sacred center, the temple center of the city of Athens. There was once a whole set of different temples on the top of that hill, okay? The Persians came in and destroyed them, okay? Came in and destroyed them. This is part of an archaic temple back in the day. And so this one was actually found in like on the Acropolis, kind of in a cemetery for the old images. So the Athenians took the old sculptures that used to be in the temples or in front of the temples or on the temples, and they actually buried them on that sacred mountain. And so today you can find this sculpture in the Acropolis Museum at the foot of the Acropolis. So it's like not on the top of the hill, it's in the valley. So it was a part of a sacred temple, okay? So how is it different than its original condition and what is the function? So it was painted to be more lifelike. And the video, if you watched it, goes into it quite elaborately. I actually had an image of it on the agenda yesterday because I thought we would get this far. All Greek sculptures were painted back in the day, especially if they were made out of stone. I'm not actually sure about the bronze ones. The bronze ones probably were not painted, but all of the stone ones were painted, all the marble ones. And the reason that they would have been painted is to appear more lifelike. Just like the Egyptians, they would have painted the skin a color, the hair a color, the eyes, the clothing, the decoration. And so if you had this, let's say, on top of a very large temple, you would be able to read the imagery a lot more clearly. Okay, that's what color does, is it brings out the details. It makes it more lifelike. She, like I said, would have been painted, and we think she had a crown, right? She obviously is missing an arm, right? And she probably had bronze earrings. We think she was probably holding something in her arm, in her hand. You notice that there is a hole in her hand. Okay, and so what is the function? There are many theories. We do not exactly know who she is. We don't exactly know, okay? So when we have to prove something, like if AP wrote a question and said, what is the function of this and what is the visual evidence that explains that, or the contextual imagery that explains this, you would want to be able to justify your response, right? So we think that this is a core, not a chorus, a core. I have that up there wrong. I apologize. So chorus, K-O-R-E. A chorus is a male figure. A core is a female figure, okay? Instead of being grave markers, the female images typically were offerings to the gods. Images of priestesses, images of goddesses. They were typically found at temples, right? So these were not grave markers like the male figures were, okay? So these are cores. So she would have been an offering to Athena. Athena is the patron goddess of the city of Athens. You probably already know that, right? There are other sculptures like this found in that graveyard, right? So that would be your contextual evidence, right? Another contextual evidence would be that it was found on the Acropolis, right? It was found on the Acropolis, and that's where the temples were, okay? It could also be goddesses, right? This could be a representation of a goddess. It could be Athena, right? I'm actually going to drop to the bottom one. Athena, right? All of the temples on the Acropolis are dedicated to Athena. Every single one. Every single one. The Parthenon is where the Colossus sculpture of her eventually goes. All of the imagery on it is either connected to Athena or the birth of the city or the people who live in the city. It's all about her, right? And so because all of the temples are dedicated to her, it makes us think that maybe this is an early representation of her, right? The one that probably has the most evidence based on what she's wearing is that she's the goddess Artemis, okay? She was the goddess of the hunt. And so because she had all those animals all over her skirt, and she could have been holding a bow, an arrow, right? We think it could be Artemis as well. So once again, it could be a priestess. Maybe she had her hand extended out, and maybe there was a bowl or a vessel where you could give offerings to her, right? So she could be an attendant at the temple. She could have been a representation of a goddess, okay? So what that visual evidence is what she looks like, right? You know, her being a priestess, right? She looks like a common everyday woman. What she's wearing, right? How her hair is done, right? But then if she had a crown, if she had, you know, these things on her gown, what was she wearing? Or excuse me, what was she holding? We don't exactly know. That might tell us that she was a priestess. So these are representations of what we think she looked like with the crown and the bow and arrow. So this really makes her look like she's maybe Artemis instead. Okay, but once again, I want to make sure I showed you when you go to the Acropolis Museum, and I say that because of course you guys are going to all become world travelers once we can travel a little bit more freely. And these are the kind of common everyday outfits that women of Athens would wear. So the chiton and the Peplos was basically like, you know, it would drape across your body and you might cinch it with a waist. These are the chitons, which get much more elaborate. It's an off-shoulder number. And often we show her with like wrinkles and ruffles. These are all archaic core figures, right? So the Koros figures are the male figures. Those are grave markers. The cores were placed at temples. Okay. Now, we have here two archaic sculptures with a major difference. Actually, a couple of major differences. This is called the Calfbearer, right? Do you see that he's wearing clothing and he has a beard? Do we think he is a Koros? Is he a grave marker? No, he would have been placed at a temple. That would be an offering to the gods, that calf on his shoulders. So not all male figures from the archaic period are cores, right? Not all of them are grave markers. Some of them too were votives or offerings to the gods at the temple sculptures. Okay, now we're gonna unpack the Acropolis in Athens, but I want to show you that there are many different Acropolises in all the major cities. This is the one in Delphi on the mainland in Greece. Okay, and so what you notice is the location of our temples, right? Where do the gods live in ancient Greece or in Greek mythology? Where do the gods live? Okay. They live in Mount Olympus. They live in the mountains. And so these sacred sites were placed on hilltops. So almost all of the Acropolis of ancient Greece are in the hills, right? In Athens, it's on the tallest prominent peak, and we'll see that as well. And it's also built into the landscape. And that's something we're going to see is kind of like a major difference between the Romans and the Greeks. The Romans would demolish the land to put up their temples. They like reconfigured it. They're kind of like us Americans. We just like go through and like get rid of everything to build stuff on top of it. And the Greeks would build into the natural landscape. So their Acropolises aren't always like axial, right? So like you just kind of have a center aisle, you keep going, you see all the important things. you're like forced to kind of meander around and see the temples in nature. So there's this connection with the natural world that you see with the Greeks that we won't see with the Romans. So when you look here, you can see that they had theaters built into the hillside. They had temples. They had different temples. And one of the major pieces that was found at Delphi is the Chariter. So the ancient Greeks not only made marble sculptures, they made bronze sculptures too. And so this one would have been placed on the top of a colossal column. And there would have been they had the Delphian Games. So it's kind of like the Olympics. And so this would have been an image to represent a victor of a chariot race. And so it would have been placed on top. And so these sculptures were made out of bronze. Now, not a lot of Greek bronzes are still around. Does anyone know why? Why is there not a lot of Greek bronzes? Yeah. Exactly. So the ancient Romans, and then of course medieval times and Renaissance times, they would melt the bronze and make them into new sculptures. So like the Christians love to take ancient Roman stuff and ancient Greek stuff, melt it and make Christian symbols, or they would turn it into things like coins, or they turn it into things like weapons. So it was buried in the ground, and that's why it still exists today. And so it actually is made out of bronze. Some of the details on the eyes actually have silver so that you can actually see, because they almost like comes to life. This is called the severe style, kind of like early classical period, but it's done in a process we call the lost wax process. And so the Greeks established this tradition of bronze casting, and we see other cultures doing a very similar process. So basically what they did is they did like a wooden armature, and they would put clay around it, right? They put clay around it to kind of form the body. So it was very realistic because it's clay. You can really take your time to get good detail. And then what they would basically do is cover that with wax, and then cover the wax with more material. So like a clay, another sort of material that would hold its shape. And then they would melt the wax away so that there was like an inner core. And you probably have seen things like this, like for like chocolate work or like in food, how there's like a space for things to go. And so basically they would melt the wax and then pour molten bronze in, and then they would crack the outer shell, and then they'd have a hollow bronze figure, because you would use less material if it was hollow, right? You would use less bronze. And so there's not a lot of these. These are called the Reese warriors, warrior A and B. They were found in a shipwreck off the peninsula of Italy. And these are more like classical bronzes. They have that contrapposto with idealized body. Now this is an image of Zeus, right? Or Poseidon, we don't know, right? If it's Zeus, what do you think was in this hand? A lightning bolt. If it was Poseidon, it was probably a trident. How do the Greeks portray their gods differently than the Egyptians? For what? Well, the pose is definitely more dynamic. You are right. So they're a lot less stiff. Anything else? Yes, Amy. Right. Gods were in the image of man, right? So the Greeks saw their gods in human form, and they had weaknesses, didn't they? You've heard the different stories of the Greek gods. They were not perfect. They had weaknesses. They had trials and tribulations. And so they viewed themselves kind of through their gods. And so very human-like. Now this is a colossal sculpture. So this one is bigger than life, which is probably befitting for a god. Okay. So here we can see the transformation from archaic to early classical to high classical, right? What's the biggest difference that you see between this style of early classical and this one of high classical? Go ahead, chit chat with each other. What's the biggest difference? You guys ready? You guys did a good job. I hear a really good thing. So what's the biggest difference between the middle one and the one on the right? What's something you guys said over here? Which one's more relaxed, the one in the middle or the one on the right? You think the one on the right is more relaxed? I don't know if I'd say relaxed. Because to me, he looks like he is moving forward. We'll get into the pose, so I'll be able to pinpoint that in a second. Anything else that we said over here? Yeah. It does. He looks like he could come to life, doesn't he? So he's got much more realism in his muscle structure, in his stance, in his like his muscle definition, which we were mentioning. His face has a little bit more description to it. His skin texture, his hair texture. Anything else? Okay, we're gonna try our poses. So stand up, stand up. We're gonna become archaic, just to prove the point here. Okay. So archaic, we got our left foot in front and arms stiff, right? Not very comfortable, right? But remember that left forward leg is all about I'm moving forward, right? There's a sense of confidence there. If we go into the middle, right? What I want you to do is to put your weight on your left foot. So you're going to kind of lean on your left foot, and it's going to be the stable one. And your right knee's going to pop up just a little, right? So your weight is shifted. So like we have bad posture here, and put your weight on your left foot. Okay. So this is kind of like I'm being a little lazy, but I look more realistic, right? Like how people tend to stand, especially when they have bad posture. Okay. So this is, I always have to work on this. Okay. So right foot down, as if you're taking a step forward. Okay. Back foot is like toes are kind of like on the ground. And then we've got left foot, left arm up, right? What am I doing? I'm probably running, right? So it's actually much more of an active pose, right? Based on the weight distribution. So you guys can sit down. But once again, this is opposite, right? This idea of counterbalance. And so counterbalance isn't just about realism, it's also about the expression of power and movement. And so if I am running here, right, one leg and one arm, the opposite are really active, and the other ones are relaxed. So it's engaged and relaxed because the Greeks love balance, right? It's that balance of calm and active, right? And so we see that over and over again in Greek art, right? So that leads us to 34, which is called Doryphoros, the spear bearer. And we know the artist of the original, and that is Polykleitos. This is not the original. This is a Roman copy. But it's such an important sculpture that they included it in the 250. The original would have been in bronze. Okay, so the original was in bronze, probably melted away to make a cannon, right? And this is an example of high classical sculpture. Okay, so I went to go look at the link for this and it said it was blocked. Did anyone try to watch the video on this one and it said it was blocked? No, you were able to watch it. I think maybe at school it was blocked from Khan Academy because of the nudity. But when I went to Smart History, it was fine. So I just wanted to double check to make sure that you were able to watch it because we could watch it if we needed to. You guys all okay? So the function of this. What is the function of this sculpture? What was it used for? At least the original, what was it used for? Anyone take that note when they watch the video? Do we watch the video? Yes? Okay. Okay, so when we're looking at the video, we're going to focus on the function of it and how it represents chaos. Let me make sure. Chaos and order. Chaos and order. Come on. There it is. Whoop, whoop, whoop. Oh, it's that way.
What is perfect? Well, the ancient Greeks thought the human body was perfect, but for them, it was not an individual that was perfect. It was like almost mathematical precision where the proportions of every part of the body were perfect in relationship to the others.
We're looking at an ancient Roman copy of a Greek bronze original by the great artist Polykleitos, who sought out to demonstrate just that. What would perfect ideal beauty be? Thinking about the mathematical relationship of each part of the human body to the other and in relationship to the whole.
This is a sculpture called the Doryphoros. Doryphoros means a spear bearer, and he would have originally been holding a bronze spear. We call it the Doryphoros. Polykleitos apparently called it cannon, not to mean a piece of armament, but a kind of idealized form that could be studied and replicated. That is, a set of ideas that you followed.
The idea.
I'm going to stop that for a second. So this was a cannon, right? This was a model to represent perfection of the human form. Okay, he wrote a whole treatise about it. He wrote about perfect proportions, perfect order. He talked about how it should be part of sculpture as well as the representation of the human form. So this is like a model. All other artists should look at this as an example of what perfection of the human form is, right? It wasn't a sculpture to the gods, right? It wasn't meant to be placed in front of a temple, right? It wasn't a chorus, which was a representation of a dead soldier, right? It is athletic though, because he's a spear bearer, right? And he, could be a soldier.
The idea that you could create a perfect human form based on math was really part of a bigger set of ideas for the Greeks. If we think about Pythagoras, for example, Pythagoras discovered that harmony in music was based on the mathematical relationship between the notes.
In fact, Pythagoras tried to understand the origin of all beauty through ratio. And so it follows that the Greeks would be looking for that in one of the forms that they felt were most beautiful, that is the human body. The Greeks would perform their athletics nude, celebrating the body and its physical abilities. But even when they represented figures in noble pursuits like this figure, we have a figure whose clothes have been taken off. This is not because soldiers went into battle nude in ancient Greece, but because this sculpture is not about warfare. It's not a portrait of an individual. This is a sculpture that is about the perfection of human form.
This is found in a palestra in Pompeii, a place where athletes would work out, perhaps as a kind of inspiration for them.
So that's another layer of meaning. The Romans loved Greek art and had it copied in marble very often. And even in a city like Pompeii, we found thousands of sculptures that are copies of ancient Greek originals. This is based on a sculpture that is at the very beginning of the classical period, before the Parthenon sculptures, but it's after the archaic figures. It's after the standing figure that we know as the Kouros. Here, the Greeks have turned away from the stiff renderings that had been so characteristic of the archaic and have instead begun to examine the human body and understand its physiognomy. This is one of the classic expressions of contrapposto.
The Doryphoros stands on his right foot. His left leg is relaxed. The right leg is weight bearing, but the left hand would have been weight bearing with the spear. Similarly, the right arm is relaxed. So there's a sense of counterbalancing and harmony in the composition of the body.
In a Koros figure, you have both feet firmly planted, although one leg is forward. But nevertheless, if you were to draw a line between the ankles, they would still be horizontal to the floor.
And in a Koros, the figure is symmetrical.
Here, both of those things have changed. And you see that his left ankle is up. And so you have a tilt of that axis. The axis of the knees are tilted in the opposite way. The hips are parallel to the axes of the knees, but also tipped. And then look what happens as a result of that. In those earlier figures, there was a perfect symmetry and a perfect line that could be drawn down the center of the body. Here, there's a gentle S curve. And you can see, for instance, that his right side is compressed compared to the left side, because the left hip is literally hanging down over that free leg. It's not being supported.
To complete that sense of balance and harmony, Polykleitos turned the head slightly, breaking that symmetry of the archaic Koros figures. With the invention of contrapposto by the Greeks in the 5th century BCE, we have, for the first time in Western art history, figures who seem fully alive, as though they move in the world. They're like us.
This is a sculpture that is, for all of the complexity of what we just discussed, is simply walking. But the mechanics of the human body walking are incredibly complicated. Here we have a civilization that not only was interested in understanding through careful observation how the body moved, but were interested culturally in capturing that. And so we have a society that puts human potential at the center.
And creates figures who are not transcendent, who don't exist in a separate world, but who exist in our world. They're, in a way, ideal mirrors of ourselves.
Okay. So I saw a lot of good note taking, so that's great. Let me get rid of that here. Okay, so once again, this is, right, this is a model of perfection of the human form. And so we have that ideal of the active body, right, the active body. He's moving forward, he's got a spear in his hand, he's like getting ready for action. But how does that contradict his face? How does the activity of his body contradict his face? How is his face represented? Exactly. And the Greeks, pretty much until the Hellenistic period, the time of the Romans, their faces were cool, calm, and collected. Because the Greeks believed in being rational, right? They believed in keeping your mind and your body at balance, right? And so there's this sense of order and calm in the face, but activity and action in the body, right? You need to be rational, right? Remember that they were really into philosophy and debate, right? And so we see that in even how they depict the features of the human face, right? And so we talked about it being a model, right? That he's much more active, but that idea of order and chaos. Order in the calm face, right? Chaos in the activity. Order in the balance as well, because he's got that active, opposite active, like active arm, active leg, opposites, right? There's a sense of balance and order there too. So the theme for the Greeks is called "Man is the measure of all things." And so this is a quote that comes from a temple of Apollo. And it is really based on the idea that the human figure should be shown in perfect proportion. So Polykleitos wrote a treatise, and he basically described to all future artists, painters and sculptors alike, how you should represent the human body. You should use very rational measures using the head as a measure of unit for the whole body. They also believed in using the golden ratio, a mathematical proportion that created a sense of balance and order as well. Right? So mathematical, the word man here is human, right? Mathematical kind of goes with measure. They use mathematical proportions and the golden ratio for so many things. The proportions of the figure, right? How they created order within their temple. Their temples prescribed to ratios or the golden ratio, right? So they use mathematics to design and make it feel balanced and orderly. So the idea of measure equals balance and symmetry, balance of body and mind, right? Balance of body and mind. So you should have a cool, calm, collected mind, right? A rational mind, a calm mind. You should use your mind to debate philosophy, right? You should be educated, and your body should be fit, and you should take care of it, but you also should do some good work with it, right? And then the Greeks had three major ideals: humanism, rationalism, and idealism. And we can see that represented in their arts, right? So humanism is the concept that man can accomplish, right? It's a very American ideal. If I work hard, I should be able to do well in life, right? Early kind of American democracy was rooted in things that they learned from the Greeks and the Romans, right? So humanism, you should seek to understand yourself, know thyself, right? Even the gods were in human form, right? We just saw that image of Zeus or Poseidon, right? So gods were in the human form, and the perfect human should be athletic and smart, according to the Greeks, right? Rationalism is that you should have your reason over your emotion. You should think logically rather than feel to decide what you should do, okay? And this was rooted in the philosophers of the day, right? You probably know, you know all these names, right? So all aspects of life should be related to order and pattern. So like when we talk about art, this impacted the canon of proportions of the human figure, right? The order in architecture and the perfect mathematical systems of proportion in both. And then lastly, idealism. We saw idealism in the ancient Egyptians, right? We should represent the humans in the most ideal form. So this idea of perfection and balance. And it's really shaped by humanism, right? You should be your best self, so we should represent humans in their best self, right? And then rationalism, right? We see rationalism in using ratios in theory, in a formula. If I know temples look like this, all temples should look like this, it's very rational and orderly. Okay. So this, all of these lines here and the spiral is all based on that golden ratio. Okay. So what are the characteristics of high classical? These are things you can write in with our Doryphoros, right? It's based on mathematical precision. There's actual and visual symmetry, so a sense of balance. Now, in a temple, you go right down through the middle. There's actual symmetry, right? But in the human form, right, even though it's not mirrored, right, it's that sense of balance of the active, active, passive, passive, right? The engaged and the relaxed, right? That calm face that we mentioned is very characteristic of high classical sculpture. The active body, engaged muscles. You can see which muscles are flexed and which ones are relaxed. introduction of contrapposto, right? We didn't have that in archaic. And so we have two archaic sculptures, right? We have the core and the poros, right? And then we have our sculpture, our Roman sculpture that we're going to count as our, right? And then it has the ideal body in proportion and being that it is athletic, right? And then there's an ideal sense of beauty. There's a lot of soft skin, especially on the face, maybe not the body, but soft skin in the face, a symmetrical face, perfect proportion. Oh, and then the female figures have wet fabric. This is not in the 250, but this is the three goddesses. It's probably one of the most famous images that comes off of the Acropolis pediment, or excuse me, the Parthenon pediment. And this kind of alludes to the grave Celia Pegasus that we saw yesterday, on how the fabric, like the images of women, always look like they're wearing wet clothing. And that once again is to show the ideal female body through clothing, right? Because females were not shown nude at this time. It happened in the late classic period. Okay, so we're gonna stop there. We're a little bit behind. So for homework, only focus on 19. Don't worry about 20. Just focus on 19, okay? But I'm actually okay with that because I want to make sure that we have a good grasp of Greek because of what we talked about yesterday. If we have a good knowledge of Greek, we're going to understand the Romans better, the Renaissance artists better, and the neoclassical artists better, okay?